Hello everybody and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here and today I'm going to demonstrate this lovely sea and sky for you in watercolour. Today I'll be painting on this block of Arsh brand watercolour paper. It's cold press 100% cotton, 7 by 10 inches or 18 by 26 centimetres. The colours I'm using today are all on screen at the moment, but I'll pop a full list of everything I'm using in the video description below for anybody who's interested. As you can see, I've got my little paint palette set up next to me, so I hope you guys enjoy seeing the paint mixing process as well as the painting process today. But as you can see, I'm starting just by simply putting a wash of clean water over the sky section of my painting, which I've just roughly sketched in pencil first, just really simply outlined the sweep of the coast and a little bit of headland. So I'm beginning today with some cerulean blue in my 1-inch flat brush. This is a Princeton Neptune Mottler flat brush. It's synthetic and it's really lovely to work with. It picks up lots and lots of paint and water, so you can work really well with it over larger areas. And you can see I'm using it to just put a sweep of pale cerulean across parts of the sky here. Now coming in with some lavender blue here as well, which is a really lovely sky colour. It's a slightly opaque colour as well, which just helps to add a bit of body into these washes, which when you're painting with such light colour can sometimes look a bit faded, a bit washed out and a bit weak. So the lavender blue really helps with that, I find. And now I'm just using a little bit of raw sienna, and this is just adding a sort of warm golden glow to the outline of the cloud that I'm going to pop across this sky here. And you can see I've switched to a rounder brush. This is a mop brush from Estoda Ultimo. It's a lovely synthetic mop brush. Again, holds lots of paint and lots of water and lets you really start working into that sky without having to constantly go back in and pick up more water. I'm also adding a little of this pink colour here. This is some cobalt violet. It's a really lovely colour, and you can see I'm using it quite sparingly, quite lightly, only taking up a tiny little bit on my brush at a time, because it's also quite a powerful colour and I don't want it to overwhelm this painting. So now I'm taking a little bit more lavender blue from my palette and working into the clouded area and just giving a little bit of shape to that, a little bit of extra colour and dimension. Again, using the rounder mop brush rather than the flat brush, just to create softer shapes here. I still want to keep that nice sort of bright glow we've got a little higher in the page, where we've got the raw sienna and some of the white paper peeking through for the sun as well. So it's just about getting that combination of colours right, getting the shadows there, but also maintaining those lovely bright pale colours as well. As you can see, I'm working wet in wet, and I'm also mixing plenty of water with my paints before popping them onto the paper as well. Now I decided this sort of patch of pale cloud was looking a little bit blocky, so this is me just skimming a little bit of blue into parts of it here just to break it up a little bit, have some lovely blue sky, some shadows just sort of peeping through that bright area. And at this point you can see that I'm using my soft brush almost like you would a sponge, and just dabbing in colour here. And in fact you could use a sponge if you have any art sponges. They're great fun to use, and they work really well for this technique. I have a couple myself, and they're really great fun actually to use to paint skies. So maybe I will do that next time for you, and we can all have a bit of fun with some art sponges. But for now, as you can see, the lovely sort of softness of this imitation, this is an imitation squirrel mop that I'm using here. Really nice soft bristles, and the paint just goes on really softly, and you can just sort of dab it on really carefully, a little bit like you would with a sponge. And when you work wet and wet, it gives you this nice sort of soft textural effect. Now at this point I'm adding one more colour to my palette. I'm adding in a little bit of neutral tint, which is a lovely neutral dark colour, and this is just going to help emphasise the shadows underneath this little cloud bank here. So you can see I've mixed up the neutral tint with a bit more lavender on my palette, and I'm using a small brush to just trace in some little wispy shadows down here at the base of this cloud formation, just to get a few darts into this painting. And then just scratching in a couple of really quick wispy darker clouds as well. And now with the colour in place, I'm using my mop brush again to just soften down some of those lines. The neutral tint again is just such a lovely colour to use if you're painting skies, or if you're painting just landscapes in general actually, because it sort of does do what it says on the packet. It is a lovely neutral colour, and it can help if you think part of your painting is looking a bit too bright or a bit too gaudy, or if you just need a few darts in there, a few shadows underneath something, and you just mix it with whatever colour palette you are using. So in this case I'm using lots of blues, got this lovely lavender, so I mixed it with a bit of the lavender and it's given me this lovely natural looking shadows. So now I'm going to leave the sky alone now, and try not to fiddle with it anymore. I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to put in the rest of the colour. I'm going to paint the sea wet and wet in a very similar way to the way that I put in the sky to begin with, because I basically want a much simpler version of this sky reflecting in this lovely stretch of water here. So once again I am beginning with a really light layer of cerulean blue, and I'm blending that right up to the horizon line. And now I'm adding in another little bit of lavender for deeper colour further down the page, closer to where the viewer will be, and the colour will naturally look richer. And I'm just blending those two again using my little 1-inch flat brush, just to get some really nice blending and really nice sort of soft diffusion down here. You can see I picked up a tiny little bit of neutral tint as well, just to mix with the colours on my palette, and just add that extra shading right down on that bottom left corner. And now you can see I'm adding it in the shoreline. This is just a lovely sort of neutral tinted colour. You can see there on the palette I just mixed up some of my neutral tint with a little water and the remains of my cobalt violet, and it's created just this lovely sort of neutral toned, darker dusty colour that I'm just now using the flat brush again to dab in around the faint pencil outline that I still have that just denotes sea and shore, and just getting that colour in whilst the sea is still wet, so we get this lovely soft transition around this line. As you can see, I'm using the sort of flat edge of this brush because I don't want it all to be too sort of smooth. I want a little bit of rougher texture here to show sort of the texture of the beach. And now I'm just going to come in with a smaller brush, mixing up some more of that shade. Ran out of cobalt violet, being a little bit too careful with it. So now I just mixed up a little bit more of that shade with plenty of water, and my small brush, you can see here, just coming in and trying to just match up that horizon line and just get those little extra details in those places that the wider brush has trouble reaching. Now here you can see I'm doing a little bit more colour mixing, so I'm pulling down some neutral tint, a little bit more cobalt violet and plenty of lavender into this patch on my palette here. I say palette, it is actually a small ceramic plate which works well for me as a palette. And you can see I'm really sort of getting the colour up into my brush, getting a good decent amount of this lovely dark colour, which I'm making sure is tinted the right tone to go with the rest of the painting. Don't want it too sort of dark and black. I want that hint of lavender and cobalt violet to still run through. And just dabbing it in here where I have penciled in a couple of little bits of land. So we've got this small outcropping here, which I'm just painting in quite roughly using the mop brush and just dabbing in the paint quite richly just to make sure that it stands out from that sea and sky. And now because I put that in with quite rich dark paint, I'm able to pull a little bit of texture out by scrunching up a little piece of tissue. You can see there I've balled it up really quite tightly so you get a little bit of texture, and I'm just dabbing it in and rotating around so I've got a clean part of the tissue hitting the paint at any given time, so it doesn't sort of smear or smudge or make marks. And we've got a lovely little bit of texture really simply into that island there. So now I'm just adjusting my watercolour block away from my palette because I want to work on this very right hand side. And you can see I'm just mixing up some more of that dark colour. I'm pulling a little bit of ultramarine in as well into that mix, along with some more cobalt violet, just to really make those colours sing, and just to help emphasise those lovely darks. And again, I'm just using my mop brush to loosely go over the pencil outline that I already had for the main headland here. Now you'll see here that I'm putting in a touch of raw sienna as well. My apologies, you can't see that on my palette because I've had to sort of shuffle everything over to make sure that I wasn't getting my arm in the paint into my paint palette as I was painting. But I think you can see there that I just dabbed in some quite strong raw sienna just to give a little bit of contrast, a little bit of interest and detail. And now I'm dabbing out some of the colour in that shorter, smaller part of the headland that is, of course, further away from us, so it would naturally be a little paler. So I'm dabbing some of the colour out of that with the tissue to make it lighter, and just emphasising a little bit more darkness and getting a little bit more texture into this larger part, which is, of course, slightly closer to us. And again, you can see that I'm using the scrunched up tissue to help create a little bit more interesting texture into this section as well. And at this point, it's just quite fun to sort of experiment a little bit just with your colours and shapes to see what you can create. Some people I know favour scratching rocks in with the sort of tip of a card, which would be a great little thing to do here. It's really up to you, it's whatever your heart desires, but you can see now that I've left everything to dry. Everything here, the sky, the sea and the land, is all completely dry, ready for the next step, which is this simple little trick to pull out some lines of white water on this incoming tide here. And you can see all I'm doing is I'm using a small flat brush and some tissue. This is a clean brush, and I'm going back and dipping it in clean water every time. And I'm actually managing to pull up some small lines in this paint and then dab out the wetness with a tissue and reveal this clean white paper underneath. And so I'm just going along and following the line of the shore, and this is just a really simple way to emulate that pattern of gentle waves, sort of gentle waves rolling in across the beach and across that shallow water coming into the shore. You do want to make sure that whilst they are quite sort of regimented, they are not completely straight and symmetrical and sort of joined up. You can see that I'm leaving some gaps between lines. I'm varying the distance between the lines that I'm putting in, and this is just to imitate that sort of natural spill and flow and ebb of the waves as they sort of roll into shore. And you can see I'm keeping to some really quite thin sort of fine lines here. This, of course, is a technique you can use to paint perhaps a stormy or a slightly more feisty sea with a lot of surf and a lot of white water rolling in. This would certainly be a handy little trick to know if you wanted to paint something like that. But assuming you'd rather want possibly a larger flat brush and to do some slightly thicker, stronger lines. But for me, this is a lovely tranquil scene, lovely calm beach scene, so I'm only putting in basically sort of a minimal thin fine lines, just that little bit of white water trundling gracefully into the shore. And there we are, so I'm all done with that stage. Again, it's all fully dry, and now all that remains is the final few details. So I'm going to add a figure standing here on the beach, staring out to sea, watching those lovely little waves come in. And I'm doing this with a really fine brush. This is a size 4/0, very small miniature brush, but of course you can use anything you like, anything that comes to a fine enough point to get the figure the size that you want. And I'm using it again to just wiggle in a sort of shadow or reflection underneath the figure there, and then dab out some colour so it's not as strong as the figure. You want your figure to be darker than their reflection on the sand. And now, of course, we can't forget a small companion, so I'm going to paint in a little dot here as well. and you can see I'm just basically doing really loose shapes for these two figures. So we've just got the tall figure that's just basically sort of a wiggly line and a head to make sure that you can see which direction they're facing, and then of course the dog, nice and simple, a couple of legs and a little pointy snout. Again, just emphasizing those reflections underneath them both, or at least I would be if you could actually see them. My apologies, but it is time for a small handful of seabirds to just finish off that sky. So again, I'm just using my fine brush here and this sort of neutral tinted puddle of paint that I've got handily on my palette to just scratch in a few really small, simple seabird shapes. I wanted to keep these quite small today, as if it's a flock sort of coming in from further out to sea, drifting into land on this lovely solitary coast. And here we are, this is the finished painting. Thank you very much everybody for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you've got any questions or comments, please pop them in the video description below. All of my equipment and paint colours and various bits and bobs like that is going to be in the video description as well if you're curious. But for now, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. If you did enjoy this video, please consider signing up to my Patreon page for more similar art videos. There's a link below that you can follow if that's something that would interest you. But that's all from me this week. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are and whatever you're up to, and very happy painting.